coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
Watching the media try to report on the Trump administration, it's the same thing trying to report on Christianity, and it's certainly the Catholic Church in general. I mean, they just beclown themselves nonstop. They have no idea what they're talking about. I'm sure it's happening already, and I'm sure it's just going to only increase. And it looks like, especially with modern popes, the span of days, because there's certain procedures and everything that they have to go through. But I think, it could happen within the next 20 days, it looks like, which is far less than what it's been in the 20th century. And certainly before that, where you had to have cardinals travel from hundreds, thousands of miles away.
I think they should still have to. I think that should be part of it. Yes, horseback or bust.
Yeah. Hey, that would weed out some of the liberals, certainly. I mean, you probably actually have something more like, Benedict XVI, which, I mean, Benedict XVI would be great. I mean, he's like possibly the Catholic Church's best theologian of the 20th century, I think. You could definitely make that argument. You also look at what's happening in Anglicanism with Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby just stepping down. You had Rowan Williams there earlier, who's probably the best theologian in that tradition in the 20th century too. So you really have kind of a passing on to kind of some ambiguity. What is the messaging going to be? Are they going to stand strong for doctrine? I mean, this is really kind of a pivotal time.
Hello, and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at the American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Klavan, associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books and editore di frottiadine at the American Mind. Only real ones will get that joke. I'm joined this week by managing editor Mike Sabo and publisher and president Ryan Williams. The gang's all here, the OG crew, and we have yet another Signal chat to talk about. You think Signal chats are really not major news items, and then you get two within the space of a couple months. This is not the Signal chat where they accidentally let in a journalist, but another Signal chat in which Pete Hegseth has accidentally, or maybe on purpose, let in his wife, Jennifer Rauchet, not exactly sure how to say that, but Jennifer, wife of Pete Hegseth, has been let in on some sensitive information, again, about the Houthis. It's like we just can't stop telling people we're so excited about our plans to bomb the Houthi rebels in Yemen that we just have to spread the news far and wide. Obviously, coming on the heels of the other OPSEC controversy, this is particularly potent, but it has opened Hegseth up to criticism from a number of angles about his wife's involvement, not just in this Signal chat, but in some sensitive meetings that seemed to require security clearance, which she doesn't have. I gather that she may have submitted paperwork to apply for that clearance, but she did not obtain it. And what's most interesting about this, I suppose, to me, is that it's the usual sort of leftist pounce story with a little bit extra from within the right. There have been calls from within the Trump coalition that Hegseth should step down from leading the Pentagon. And basically the chatter in the wake of these revelations has been, is Pete Hegseth in general doing a good job? Should this particular infraction be damning? And will he go down under the criticism from both the left and from within? It's a decision that rests with Donald Trump, who so far seems to be on Hegseth's side, insofar as he's on anybody's side. But I guess my two questions for you guys are, first of all, was this bad? How bad is it? And maybe third question, do you think Hegseth is out because of this in a matter of days?
Well, actually, the Signal chat is a piece of a bigger story if you follow the kind of mainstream DC coverage of this, the bigger deal is the recent staff churn at DoD with Dan Caldwell and a couple of Caldwell's colleagues, including the chief of staff, who I think has been moved or maybe resigned. I can't remember, but Dan was a senior advisor for policy in the front office. For anyone who's interested, I think he gave a pretty good accounting of what he was up to and his background. It's a very interesting story. A former Marine, college dropout, and then in the Marines in the kind of latter half of the global war on terror, Iraq business. Dan did a long Tucker interview, which is worth everyone's time. I would say even for non-Tucker fans, it's fairly devoid of things that might annoy people who don't like Tucker, and mostly just Dan talking about his time in government and his biography and all this stuff. Anyway, Dan and a couple of his colleagues, who I think all of whom worked with Hegseth at Concerned Veterans for America before they got into government, they were all sort of walked out of the building with the allegation that they leaked classified information to the press. Dan Caldwell denies this up and down, as he points out in the Tucker interview. If it were credible and they had actual proof, they would arrest him because it's a crime, of course. So we don't really know what's going on at DoD, but in terms of how these things play out, it's clear that the knives are out both for Hegseth and for a certain portion of his staff. I think Caldwell and others who were disproportionately skeptical of the wisdom of some wider war with Iran or even taking out nuclear sites. That's Dan sort of makes his case for why he thinks it's a bad idea in the Tucker interview. So it's clearly at least one op is being run on Hegseth. And at Dan, interesting, I didn't know this. Dan points this out in the interview, that Susan Rice still sits on a DoD advisory board. And so he suggests that if you want to look for leakers, look for the former Obama admin folks who are in this now weird alliance with the neocons on the questions of Ukraine and Iran, which Dan Caldwell and some of his friends who worked for Hegseth were on the other side of, i.e. they think Ukraine war needs to be settled, it is unwinnable, and they're skeptical of taking out Iran's nuclear sites, not because it's a bad thing to take out their nuclear sites, but because they worry about a wider conflict and American lives at risk in the region and getting mired in some wider conflict. Anyway, so it's now every episode that Amelia comes into the chat, but Amelia and I, we either at the office or both working remotely from home, upstairs and downstairs, are texting throughout the day about current events. And I texted the other day, Hegseth seems to be in real trouble. But that's the narrative that certainly the center left and the center wants to create in Washington. So we should, I think, resist it for that reason alone. You're right, Spencer. Trump seems to be sticking with him now, but Hegseth is certainly out and about doing damage control. So I think those are the lenses through which to view it. One last thing to flag, I would just a decent, intelligent reporter worth reading on this stuff, Park McDougald, wrote up what he knows and the sequencing of all of it at, I think it was at Tablet's Substack the other day. So it's worth checking that out. I think for friends of the administration and for those who desire a bit of a recalibration of American foreign policy, I think the last thing they should want is Hegseth resigning or being forced out. But it does remain the case that this business of him, he would have had to sign off on Caldwell and the others who were friends of his and who worked for him previously being escorted out of the building. So I don't know quite what to make of the internal administration knives out politics of all of this. But I'll just end with this. This is nothing new in a way. This administration is like the last one, a bit more chaotic than normal ones for various reasons, starting with just how the principal likes to operate. But this sort of roiling conflict between foreign policy visions at state and defense or wherever, I don't think there's a huge conflict between state and defense in this administration, at least not from my observations. But this is very normal for administrations to have different worldviews and security and strategy thinking vying for preeminence. So that's also what's going on.
Yeah, I think like Ryan said, it makes it difficult just in, doing some research for this podcast, just trying to figure out all these different coalitions fighting each other at the same time. You have NPR, you have Politico, who are clearly just trying to take Hegseth out. do.
Virtually devoid of information.
Yeah, absolutely.
Useless, right? Yeah.
Right, just useless. Like, seriously, they're just laying landmines for the Trump administration. I mean, that's all they're doing. They're just trying to make sure they step on something to really rock that administration early enough where, it can basically kind of be off kilter for at least until the midterms, and, the Democrats win, and then they're basically neutered. So there's that. There's definitely a war, within MAGA. Caldwell probably represents a little bit more of I don't want to use the term isolationist, but a little bit more concerned about the US getting into wars with Iran, certainly, and others, and wanting really to kind of pull back, restructure, focus on domestic politics. And then there's other people who certainly are a little bit more, think that the U.S. has a still fairly large role in the world to play, even though, yes, it was good that we are getting out of that we got out of Afghanistan. Again, not the way that we got out of it, but so there's a little bit more of a war hawk, I guess, is a term. There's from some of the other sides, like the Caldwell side. I mean, there seems to be looking at kind of neoconservatism, whatever that means. I mean, that term, honestly, even right now, to even describe anybody is probably useless. You can just pour so much into that. So I think there are probably better terms to describe kind of, one's ideas in foreign policy. But anyway, there are all these different players. There are all these different coalitions. Like Ryan said, Hegseth had to sign off on these firings. So it was Dan Caldwell, who was his senior advisor, his deputy chief of staff, Darren Selnick, Colin Carroll, the chief of staff to Deputy Defense Secretary Stephen Feinberg, and then Joe Casper, who is, I think he's still currently Hegseth's chief of staff. I'm not quite sure. Anyway, he's leaving. So that's even a separate thing. Politico reported essentially that this wasn't even, more of an ideological thing, that it was actually personality conflicts, jockeying for influence, gamesmanship. So there's that.
Is it depending on what?
Right. Like, yeah, that's shocking. So there's the human element there too. I mean, there are guys who may not get along for whatever reason. So you add that into the mix too, between all these kind of ideological fights and wars. You do have the White House. Caldwell, I watched the part of the Tucker interview where Tucker asked him point blank, did you leak classified information to, I think it was NBC News? And he denied that. It was interesting. Some people pointed out that question was worded in such a very specific way. You have to wonder if he leaked any information at all that perhaps wasn't classified. He did deny up and down that he even ever talked to an NBC reporter at all during his time at the Pentagon. The White House, though, I mean, Carolyn Leavitt, the press secretary, said the fired officials leaked to the media. And then she also responded to the smear campaign of Hegseth. But the White House is saying, yes, they did leak. Hegseth, I think himself, is on Fox News. And he said, yes, his friends, they leaked. So that's an interesting battle. Obviously, somebody's lying. Somebody's not telling the truth. Or somebody's trying to use words in a very interesting, and, less than honest manner to try to get around, I didn't do this very specific thing. Okay, but did you do the larger thing? Maybe. So I don't know. There's just so much swirling around. It's really kind of hard to see kind of really reality, but I know, and I would agree with Ryan too. I mean, Hegseth stepping down does not seem like that's going to happen. Trump has come out very forcefully. Other administration officials have too. But I mean, if Hegseth does step down and step downs early, that would certainly not be good for the administration at all.
Can I ask you, Mike, just a quick follow-up question out of genuine curiosity? What made you hesitate to use the word isolationist earlier?
Yeah, so that, I think, term has just been bandied about so much by people who are just critical of Trump's America First foreign policy. They want to tie it back to Charles Lindbergh and the America First Committee. And oh my gosh, you guys were, against getting into World War II. I just think isolationist.
It's become a slur.
Basically. Yeah, like neocon. I think that's just become a slur that's poured into anybody's idea of derision and hatred. And so that's just kind of become another just cheap kind of drive-by slur that's really commonly used.
Yeah, it's interesting because as I'm listening to you guys talk and contemplating this whole brouhaha is the fault line that is emerging and has obviously been kind of quite apparent for some time on Team Trump within MAGA world. And it's not exactly isolationists versus, interventionists or whatever the classic canonical terms are. It's sort of people who see problems in the world, and their instinct is for America to intervene proactively. And people who see global conflict emerging and their instinct is to keep us out of it as long as possible. So it's not that, I mean, one thing that isolation sort of implies is like we should never fight any wars, or we should be trying to withdraw from our current commitments. And it's more like minimalists and maximalists or something when it comes to American policing and intervention. And that is really interesting on this in this area of Iran specifically. And I've seen not just Tucker, but a number of people. I think, Mike, you said we're going to have our friend Ron Dodson maybe write about this for us. And we've had a few others as well already, pieces on the site. Trump, our listeners may recall, we talked about this when it happened. Trump wrote a very sternly worded letter to Iran, basically trying to clean up the Obama mess when it comes to nuclear power over there. And obviously, Israel, a major U.S. ally, is implicated in this whole debate. They are the power that stands most immediately in danger of Iranian nuclear strikes, although, of course, they don't like us very much either. And so the question, how aggressive to be with Iran, entails and wraps up the question, how proactively friendly, assertively friendly should we be toward Israel? Obviously, another extremely live and touchy subject among MAGA people. And it seems to me, this is where I wonder what you guys think, that Trump actually represents kind of a middle ground here. So he certainly is unhappy. He seems unhappy with the situation, not only that Biden created in Russia, Ukraine, but also the one that Obama created really in the Middle East with the Iran deal, and with his just bizarre infatuation with Iran, an idea of Iran as the future kind of arbiter of the region to replace Israel essentially with Iran, which I just think is totally insane. But he's obviously also, Trump is not about to like put boots on the ground or engage in nation building projects. It actually seems like he's more got in mind a sort of reorientation of the world order that makes America. He's got a more multipolar idea, and that's not unique to him. So I wonder if you guys think that assessment of Trump's attitude is correct, that he's not as minimalist as some of his guys, including perhaps Hegseth, although that's not clear to me. But he is certainly kind of, his theory of the case, if he has one right now, is fundamentally multipolar, and that makes him somewhat more realist and cautious about, say, intervening in Ukraine or indeed aggressing against Iran, although he did sort of make noises about doing that.
I think that's right. I mean, if you look at the conduct of foreign policy in the first Trump administration, it defied easy categorization. I mean, he got fire from the neoconservative right when he did certain things, and they didn't like his response to Iranian drone business and what looked to him, I think he concluded, to be some face-saving, quote-unquote, strikes against American military bases that ended up being really not deadly at all and just a nuisance. But then at the same time, he didn't hesitate to take out Soleimani, which he was praised by the right for, or the neoconservative faction about, or bombing chemical warfare plants in Syria. So, I think Trump is all these terms are so freighted. Realist is another one that, just like isolationist, that's maybe more opaque than it is helpful. But I think Trump takes it piece by piece. But I think his overriding desire is, or his instinct is, one of restraint, especially as opposed to the conduct of the two George W. Bush administrations and their follies in the Middle East. Yeah, I just one more note about Caldwell, again, that Tucker interview. I agree with Mike about the difficulty of the term isolationism and it's not being helpful. Caldwell says, look, the DOD's job is to have a credible threat against Iran or anyone else, and for it to be credible and realistic and feared. And that is what opens up space for diplomacy. So that's how DOD works in the whole scheme of American foreign policy. It is that fist behind which one can have a lot more leeway and a lot more leverage to get more done by talking and agreement rather than fighting. So, yeah, I do think Trump takes again, another freighted term, but he takes a pragmatic view, I think, and a non-ideological view of these things, of these conflicts.
Yeah, a word for a lot of this is
Prudence.
prudence. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Pardon me, sir. Do you mind if I tell you a little bit about classical political philosophy? I mean, this seems like an intervention that the Claremont Institute, particularly opportune now to point out that one of the major insults that people make against Trump, both on the left, but also his detractors on the right, like to say that he has no philosophy. And probably some of our friends in the more like National Review-y world would have listened to the last 20 minutes and found it completely absurd, because what are these guys talking about? They're trying to microanalyze at some sort of principle level what ultimately amounts to just raw instinct and sort of King Kongian flailing on Trump's part. And this is a very typical thing that you hear. But actually, if you sit down and think about it, you can discern two different, I mean, I kind of threw out minimalist and maximalist approaches to this set of question. And one thing we're saying here is all these isms don't really quite fit to describe the correct approach, although each one has a certain degree of validity in a variety of circumstances, and the choice between them is ultimately going to be dictated by prudence, which Trump, nobody shows it perfectly, and I would never be the first. I would never claim that Trump is like some kind of Lincolnian wunderkind when it comes to this. But yeah, we're talking about like case by case practical wisdom. I actually don't think it's crazy to attribute that to Trump as a classical political virtue.
And I think with Trump too, it's like, look, he wants to, it's just like himself. He wants to put himself out there. He wants to be honored. He wants to be feared too at the same time. He just wants the same thing for the United States. It's like his own personality writ large. So he wants peace. He wants security. And in order to do that, he's going to do things that certainly violate tenets of, say, non-interventionism, like bombing the Houthis. I know that the American Conservative and other places are very much against that kind of thing. The Quincy Institute also. And so again, he kind of defies these kind of cheap, not cheap, but I think useful labels in some ways. But you're right. I think at the end of the day, it's all about what does he think is best for the security, the prosperity, the health of the American people. I mean, you look at kind of his resurgence of the Monroe Doctrine, really looking at, the Western Hemisphere especially. And I think it's just looking at, okay, just like, his businesses, but he's looking at that in the way that the Biden administration, the Bush administration, look at the results. Look at what that's done for us. It's sacrificed blood, treasure, trillions of dollars. So we have to do something completely different. And I think these instincts, I mean, if you watch interviews with him, even in the 80s, he's talking about free trade and his arguments against that in the same way that he is now. So I think these are instincts that are probably long held, but he's really reorienting that around the world as the way it is in 2025 and saying, look, the US can't be bullied. We can't be pushed around. But that also doesn't mean we should be able to just intervene in whatever country we want and just kind of bomb whatever we want. No, this is, it looks, pretty strategic again for a guy who's, supposedly like King Kong and just smashing the China and all that. There's definitely some thinking and some sense that goes into it. And I think his instincts are really pretty good overall. Again, for a guy who supposedly doesn't know what he's doing, this makes sense in the world that we live in now.
Well, hard pivot, switching topics entirely. I'm not even going to try to construct a segue between American foreign policy and the death of the Pope, but the Pope did die, and we thought we should talk about it. I'm going to preface this by saying that all three of us here are Protestants of some variety or another and are sympathetic to Catholic doctrine, but we're probably not the podcast to listen to if you want a really granular analysis of who might or should be Pope in the future. And even I personally don't feel qualified to take a definite stance on what Pope Francis's legacy is going to be. Again, from the Catholic point of view, I'm about to summarize a variety of assessments of Francis that are coming out of Catholic circles right now, and I'm going to tentatively, I'm sure we will all tentatively opine, but really what we wanted to talk about was the stakes of what comes next for the world, the West, and the church more generally. All of those kind of capitalized, capital W world, capital W West, capital C church. And for all of those, I think the Catholic Church even if you're not a Catholic, it plays a major role. It sets doctrine and gives counsel to millions and millions of people across the world. Obviously stands historically as a pillar of the Western world and one of the major power centers, intellectual centers, spiritual, philosophical centers of Europe and indeed even America and beyond. And there are political implications here because, of course, the major thing about Francis was his politics, or the ways in which his theological views intersected with politics. So for those who need a little reminder, Pope Francis his birth name was Jorge Mario Bergoglio. He was the first Jesuit to be Pope. He was the first Latin American to be Pope, and the first born or raised outside of Europe. This was an interesting one, since Pope Gregory III, who came from Syria in the 8th century. So that's basically a first. This is like not one of those firsts where they're scraping around for like first lesbian, disabled, transracial pope to kiss a frog or something. This is like it's just a historic papacy in a number of ways that were significant. He followed two quite prominent, beloved, and towering papal figures who took the West through some major turbulence. That's, of course, John Paul II and Benedict XVI. Each of them, in their own way, influential politically, especially in the Cold War and its aftermath, dealing with the fallout of sort of Soviet anti-Christianity. And Francis, whatever else you think of him, was certainly a different kind of Pope. He was always flirting with, but never quite endorsing, and often, indeed, you might even say walking back a number of quite radical social positions. He did, in fact, alter the Catholic catechism to be against the death penalty. He played fast and loose with the church's teaching on divorce. He sort of at times seemed to make gestures of openness toward gay people and trans people, although those were always reported breathlessly in the press with much more fanfare than they actually merited, because the Catholic Church has always said, as Francis did, that we bless and love these people, even as we don't approve of their lifestyles. And in fact, he was quite traditional socially in his personal views. His most amusing run-in with the press was his use of the word frociadine, which roughly translated means factory, to describe what there is too much of in the world and in the church. And we're not going to conduct right now a close semantic and etymological analysis of this word, but I think it's fair to say that it's closer perhaps to the Greek word malakos, in that it may well include actual gay people, but it also describes wishy-washiness, effeminacy, cultural lassitude, etc. So he wasn't, in fact, quite as blunt and regressive as the translation sometimes made him sound, but he certainly was not, he was no pushover on this stuff either. And he was also known for kind of expansive gestures toward the more prophetic and service-oriented dimension of Christianity. It's always tradition for the Pope to wash the cardinal's feet on Maundy Thursday, a gesture of kind of servitude, but instead he did so with prisoners. He asked for the laity's prayers for him upon his ascension to the papacy. He turned down a number of traditional kind of signs and symbols of wealth that are associated with the papacy. So this was very much, I think, in keeping with his kind of Jesuit roots. He had this very social, you might even say social justice attitude. So, as you may imagine, he is loved and even cheered on by some non-Catholics as kind of like the nice, fluffy, liberal Pope. Doesn't seem quite right. He's also denounced by conservative Catholics as basically like the woke Pope. The truth of this must surely rest in a slightly more complicated and interesting place. There's a great piece by Nathan Pinkowski that Mike passed along to us, in which Pinkowski, who is a Catholic, argues that Francis was the first managerial Pope, meaning essentially that he reoriented the church away from results and toward process. He was the first Pope to install an HR, a human resources department in the Vatican's structure. So that would be damning enough. And arguably wokeness and managerialism are close cousins or even Siamese twins of one another. But I've said enough already, and I hope I've laid out kind of the menu options of how people are assessing Francis. I am particularly interested in, I mean, obviously express whatever opinions you want about Francis himself and his legacy, but I'm curious what you guys make of this juncture for the Catholic Church, and whether you think it's likely that they will go back to a more conservative traditional pope, and what it would mean for us non-Catholics if they didn't.
Yeah, I think the latter question is very interesting, because if you read about the political and religious turn of Gen Z and the growth of the Catholic Church, especially in America in recent years, you might argue that another woke pope would just, or wokish pope, you would think it would be good in continuing to drive into the arms of Catholicism, for lack of a better term, reactionary element of especially young right-wing men who would like to join that church and continue to try to remake it as a kind of counter reaction to an overwhelming left of center ism in the ecclesial ranks. So I don't know. I mean, the politics of it are interesting. Francis concentrated quite a bit on stacking the College of Cardinals with his ideological and theological compatriots within the Catholic Church. So it will be interesting to see what sort of new pope emerges from that process. I think there will be a huge temptation to continue the change that was started with the first Latin American pope and pick someone maybe from one of the cardinals in Africa, have the first pope of color.
Which would not, in fact, necessarily be a victory for the liberals. I mean, this is one of the things that's good about that movie Conclave, is they have like a Cardinal Sarah figure who's very hardline about stuff.
Right. Yeah. It's a risky gambit for the left to pluck a pope out of Africa, because they tend to be pretty conservative, a lot of them. Although there's a couple candidates who I think are not. So yeah, that will be interesting. I mean, I think for the world and for the right, in the best sense of that term, right, both in America and across the West, I think it would be a bad development to get another leftish wing pope, because the Catholic Church is a major civilizational ballast in the West. It of course has always been, and it will continue to be. So I think our hope would be that they turn away from the kind of creeping cultural moral relativism that you saw occasionally on display from Francis. Although we should emphasize, as you mentioned, Spencer, that it was often in comms and sort of offhanded comments rather than official documents or encyclicals. So I mean, like in the first half of Pope Francis's tenure, even a lot of our very right-wing friends who were Catholics would say, yeah, I mean, he basically pops off in public and tries to be empathetic and inclusive. But if you look at the sort of core doctrinal stuff, there's not much of a change. So, cut him some slack. Reflected in this Pinkowski piece with this gem, which I just thought it was worth sharing. I did not know these details, and many of our non-Catholic friends probably don't either. But as part of his 2022 reforms of the Curia, this is me reading Pinkowski, this is his piece in Compact Magazine, which Spencer referenced and Mike sent to us, through which the Vatican ended up with a human resources department. Francis revamped communications. The Secretariat of Communication, now renamed the Dicastery for Communication, became one of the Vatican's most important offices. It spends nearly as much as the Secretariat of State, which is tasked with running the Holy See's embassy network around the world. It spends more than the Dicastery for Evangelization, and a staggering 19 times as much as the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. So obviously a pivot to worldwide comms in a big way as a matter of budget was one of Francis's legacies. And also the other interesting, I think it was, again, I'll bring in, as I do occasionally, some of the gems of wisdom from the Commentary podcast, which, some of our listeners might not be huge fans of. But I think Matt Continetti put it pretty well yesterday, maybe, about Francis. And he said, and you'll see it in his funeral, he asked for a modest funeral. He often tried to act as the parish priest in his compassion for the flock rather than this more traditional role for the Pope, which is this more regal, authoritative pronouncer of doctrine and guidance. And so in that way, he was a marked departure from his two predecessors. I would love to see another version of Joseph Ratzinger, that was Pope Benedict, who succeeded Pope John Paul II, who had a remarkable clarity about the dangers of Islam and the dangers of modernity and its acidic erosion of standards and morality. I think that would be great for the world and great for the Catholic Church. But we shall all await the opaque College of Cardinals process, which produces white smoke at the end of it, so you know that there's a new pope. In a way, I sort of love the medieval mystery of the whole thing. That's like just an unalloyed good, even whatever the result is, because in our modern times where everything is transparent and filmed on TikTok, it's nice to have a kind of the mystery of the selection of the new pope. So it's fun to watch for that reason.
Yeah, I think watching the media try to report on the Trump administration, it's the same thing trying to report on Christianity, and it's certainly the Catholic Church in general. I mean, they just beclown themselves nonstop. They have no idea what they're talking about. I'm sure it's happening already, and I'm sure it's just going to only increase. And it looks like, especially with modern popes, the span of days, because there's certain procedures and everything that they have to go through. But I think, it could happen within the next 20 days, it looks like, which is far less than what it's been in the 20th century. And certainly before that, where you had to have cardinals travel from hundreds, thousands of miles away.
I think they should still have to. I think that should be part of it. Yes, horseback or bust.
Yeah. Hey, that would weed out some of the liberals, certainly. I mean, you'd probably actually have something more like, Benedict the 16th, which, I mean, Benedict the 16th would be great. I mean, he's like possibly the Catholic Church's best theologian of the 20th century, I think. You could definitely make that argument. You also look at what's happening in Anglicanism with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, just stepping down. You had Rowan Williams there earlier, who's probably the best theologian in that tradition in the 20th century too. So you really have kind of a passing on to kind of some ambiguity. What is the messaging going to be? Are they going to stand strong for doctrine? I mean, this is really kind of a pivotal time. Just even going into that Pinkoski piece, I mean, one of his criticisms of Francis was, kind of this cultivated kind of ambiguity where, you'd kind of say, oh, well, maybe a blessing for same-sex marriage, but, oh, that's not official, but you say things, and it's just kind of like a pushing towards something, but you look even at some of the papal encyclicals and some of the documents. I mean, how much of this was Francis and how much of this was, kind of a council coming together to put it together? The voice is kind of interesting. You also had
echoes of Biden. I mean, Francis has been in ill health, so I'll just share the Babylon Bee post that I sent to you guys. It says CNN : behind closed doors, Pope is still focused, sharp, and energetic. And then the split screen is Caitlin Collins, and then a dead Francis in a coffin. We shouldn't laugh about Francis being dead, but
yeah, no, that is not far from the truth, though, just because how bad the media has been on so much of this stuff. But yeah, so you just kind of have this, almost like, and this is another line from this Pinkoski piece, but like trying to theologize, opposition to the American right. I mean, you looked at some of his criticisms of the U.S.'s immigration, especially under Trump. You look at kind of even back and forth between him and J.D. Vance, and J.D. Vance visited the Pope, I think, the day right before he passed away. So that was just an amazing kind of coincidence, because that position, as much as Protestants may like it or not, I mean, the institutional Catholic Church is an absolutely pivotal position, I think, for the West, looking at it politically. And so who the Pope is, I think, matters for us in that sense. Obviously, with the way the College of Cardinals is going, I just don't know what kind of Pope is available. And Cardinal Sarah's there, but I think he's 77, which, a little bit older, but I think, there have been popes, I think, that have been picked that older, even older. I mean, I'm looking at the Cardinals right now, and I think it's Cardinals, I think 80 and above don't have to be there. And I mean, it looks to me almost like the breakdown, like 40% of the Cardinals are actually even older than that. So there are huge changes happening right now. I mean, just as the realignment is hitting politics, it's hitting Christianity. It seems to be hitting just everything right now. We'll see. We can hope and pray for somebody, hopefully along the lines of Benedict XVI or John Paul II. It remains to be seen. I'm probably more skeptical of that happening, but Pope like that who has foresight. I'm just thinking of, Harry Jaffa talking about an address that Pope John Paul II made just about the American founding and our ideas of liberty and the Declaration and all that, and just actually how right on he was. And then he actually criticized Antonin Scalia, saying, you should actually speak more like the Pope about these things. To get a Pope like that who really understands things at a fundamental level, who understands who we are as human beings, what we need today, and to be clear on who our enemies are, I think would be outstanding.
One quick coda, interesting dynamics at work. I mentioned young men joining the Catholic Church, but it also is happening in Anglicanism. I mean, church attendance amongst young men is up from like 4 or 5% to 20% in the United Kingdom, and women are leaving organized religion, and young men are joining. So I don't know what the Catholic College of Cardinals will make of all this and what bearing it should have, if any, on their selection of the Pope. But
yes, no,
interesting currents are afoot.
This is a huge subject that extends, I would say, even beyond the Catholic Church. And as you indicate, Ryan, it's not only affecting the Catholic Church. If you haven't yet looked at the latest Pew study of religion in America, this was passed around online lately. Its headline is that the decline in church attendance seems like it might have bottomed out for a long time. As long as I've been alive, there's been a steady decline in American church attendance. And this Pew survey, which is massive, like tens of thousands of people in all 50 states, has been tracking it with a lot of really granular data. And so they are in a good position to observe that it's not declining anymore, at least for now. So this felt like part of the vibe shift, and it was much discussed. But if you kind of dig into some of I think the word is crosstabs. I feel really trendy and on point knowing that. But if you kind of go through some of the data, there's a lot of rich and interesting information there. Some of it encouraging to people like us. Some of it, I would say, discouraging, including the fact that young people are still, in raw numbers, in absolute terms, vastly less religious than older generations. But then, Ryan, this sex thing where the guys are more attracted to these traditional, straightforward, Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, the more high church Anglicanism, and women, are sort of put off or they're not as interested. All of that obviously has major civilizational implications and makes this an even more pivotal moment for the Catholic Church. And in the same way that it's pivotal for America and for the West, is like, how are you going to react to that? I know I said I wasn't going to express too many opinions about Francis, but since it's relevant, my least favorite thing he did was the restriction of the Latin Mass, which we haven't talked about yet. But there was this uptick in people going to the traditional Latin Mass, which is obviously pre-Vatican II, a reflection of kind of the older way of doing Catholicism. And not just because it's in Latin, which is my favorite thing about it, obviously, but because of the direction, I believe, Catholic Prince can write in and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think it's got to do also with the direction that the priest faces when he's blessing the elements and saying the prayers. And so it really was a preservation of an older continuity with the church before some of the 20th century changes were made. And Francis, for all sorts of reasons that seemed to me really silly, basically required that priests get permission to do it. And this shut down a lot of these Latin masses that were filling up, that were drawing in people. And at the time, it was one of the only kind of religious services that was growing and drawing in people. So I thought that was really quite a misstep on Francis's part. And it is an example of the sort of thing that a pope can do, even without, speaking ex cathedra or actively changing church doctrine. Because a lot of this stuff, as we've discussed, right, he said all kinds of stuff that I just found incredibly dumb, which as a Protestant I am allowed to say. For instance, basically, you shouldn't worry too much about the different religions because we're all worshiping the same God. And this is just whatever you may think about that claim, it is definitively not what Catholicism is about. It's almost the opposite of Catholicism. And so that sort of thing was very grating to a lot of people and very galling. But a common misconception that non-Catholics have about Catholicism is that when the Pope says something like that, it has some sort of binding effect. it obviously has an influential and cultural effect. But this whole idea of papal infallibility, that he can never make mistakes, that his word is law, like there's only very, very select circumstances in which that is true. All of that having been said, he can make major structural changes, major changes of the kind that Penkovsky is writing about. And he can either welcome and support this new interest among young men in kind of the rigors of religion, in a religion that won't just accommodate them, but will actually teach them how to be. Or he can greet that with a certain contempt and disdain, which Francis often did sort of express. Ryan, you make a really interesting point, which is it's unclear which of those would be more likely to increase the fervor among young men for trad calf stuff, since young men, one thing that young men also really love is to be doing the forbidden thing and to like break the rules. So there might have been this weird optimal combination in the Latin Mass under Francis where it was like kind of forbidden, but also rigorous and hierarchical. And anyway, all of this just to say, like, the church is transforming and people's interest in relation to the church is transforming. And my kind of exterior prayer for the Catholic Church is that they'll get somebody that really is hip to that and wants to do everything he can to encourage it and to sort of prop it up where it's flagging, like, for instance, among women.
Yeah, the sociological explanation is that punk rock Catholicism right now is a return to traditional orthodoxy. So if you had yet another, like, you can't tell me what to do, dad, pope from the left, then you'll get, all else equal, you'll get more punk rock Catholicism, which would be trad Catholicism. So
yes, and to Mike's point, many such cases. This is another dynamic that is not limited to the Catholic Church, where conservatism is punk rock, and is it maybe bad for us to go mainstream, and all of this. You know, we face the problem. Maybe what we should all be doing is reading the memoirs of like 1980s rock stars, because then they would like tell us how. This is like the classic dilemma that's faced in every biopic. Does Fleetwood Mac stay together? Do they, does Dylan go electric?
Right. Did Metallica sell out with the Black Album? Like, going from Injustice for All, like total progressive metal, all of a sudden, they're selling out, 20,000 seat arenas every night.
I said punk rock, so I was just thinking of Sid Vicious, of course.
Oh, yeah. Exactly. Johnny Rotten, yeah. Yep.
Good. Well, we've come out of this with a good new homework assignment, which is to study the lives of rock stars and figure out how to go mainstream without losing your soul. We definitely have some good recs for people this week, and we clearly, turns out, had a lot to say about both of these topics. So I'm just going to perhaps put a pin in my Ivy League update for next week, which will be good because I'm at Cornell right now, and that's why I maybe sound a little different. Is because I'm in my hotel room about to go give a speech on the existence of God for the Heterodox Academy at Cornell, and we were thinking that's kind of interesting given that the Ivies are a big subject of political scrutiny right now. Obviously, Donald Trump has asked them to make a bunch of really sweeping changes to encourage viewpoint diversity, to hire more conservatives, to address anti-Semitism on campus, which remains pretty serious. I mean, just as we were starting to record, a Twitter account that I've never heard of before by a guy called Nathaniel Crispy posted a picture of my alma mater, Yale, at a very prominent central courtyard that I recognize where the Beinecke Library is, and student in a yarmulke is trying to get by these masked keffiyeh wearing protesters who interestingly are not chanting from the river to the sea, but have come up with something else to rhyme with Palestine will be free. They've obviously gotten the message that is sort of bad PR to chant from the river to the sea. And anyway, this Jewish student is prevented from walking across the plaza where that famous library is, and that's like how you get to the main dining hall is there. It's an incredibly central location. So anyway, Trump is responding to all of this. Some might even say using it as a pretext to threaten the withdrawal of major amounts of federal funding. Harvard University has basically said, stuff it, we're going to continue to host our pro-Hamas organ demonstrations, and taking a brave stand in defense of Hamas, I guess. But no, there are questions here about, well, should universities be getting out of the federal funding business altogether so that there isn't any kind of conflict between government interests and the liberal arts? I am hearing some interesting things from my host here at Cornell, who told me, I think the Ivies they're either 51% good for the country or they're 51% bad for the country. And I haven't decided which one they are. So if you guys have anything that you want to just quickly say on this whole shebang before we go, please do. But next week, I will give a further report of how the speech goes and exactly what it's like here at Cornell.
Yeah, I'll just, I'm going to butcher his name because it's long, but he does these often in the Wall Street Journal. I would just flag Tunku Varadarajan's interview with Larry Arnn and write up of it. It's a great Larry Arnn interview. Those of you who know Larry, it's like pitch perfect Larry, kind of homespun common sense with deep learning behind it. And his response is, well, yeah, I mean, if Harvard wants to run itself like a private institution, maybe they have the makings of a court case here, but really what they should do is stop taking federal money and earn an honest living. And then they can do what they want as a private university. But with a third of their budget or whatever it is coming from the feds, basically, Larry doesn't put it this way, but he's like, cry me a river when they're complaining about federal efforts to tell them what they ought or ought not to do.
I would second that interview too as well. They cite, Harvard has an endowment. I was surprised even by reading this, $53 billion. Okay, Trump is acting, he's going to withhold federal funds, $2.26 billion. What are they doing with all that money? Are they really in that dire straits where $2 billion is just going to absolutely tank them? And if so, that speaks to greater malfeasance with funds and all kind of stuff going on there. So that just kind of brings into stark relief, what we're talking about. It's kind of on a scale, conservatives always talking about defunding NPR. Really, it's like, you guys should be able to exist on your own. There are people who use your, listen to your stations, who use your resources all the time. So, this is about, look, taxpayers shouldn't be subsidizing this stuff. They shouldn't be subsidizing people and creating students and forming people who actually actively despise their country. It seems just pretty common sense, but yeah, looking forward to talking about this further next week.
Roger that. Yeah. I will third the recommendation of the Arnn article and just preview my opinions by saying I think there is a lot to the libertarian argument here. Not a sentence that you will often hear on the American Mind podcast, that the libertarians might have this one right. But Ryan is fond of occasionally throwing a bone to the libertarians, and this is a place where you might say, yeah, what exactly is the argument for, if you're so upset and you want to take this courageous stand and you want to not be told what to do by the government, what exactly is the argument for taking money from the government?
Yeah, it's case, like play federal funding reliance games, win federal funding prizes. Just, they tell you
exactly right. When you take money from people, they can tell you what to do, and they might choose not to because they are kind, but they also can. And if the people are the taxpayers, and then you spend all that money and time and prestige telling the average American taxpayer that they're stupid and evil, eventually taps can run out.
So the last thing I'll say is it's analogous to the immigration fight, which is, Harvard needs to be very careful because this is just a political winner for Trump. It's like going after Harvard, getting $9 billion a year of federal taxpayer money. Most Americans are not going to shed a tear for Harvard getting slapped around and getting its funding taken. So
you won't even get all Harvard grads to get upset about that. And I think 100% of Yale grads would be delighted. In any case, quick round of recommendations. You guys have anything you want to plug for the people before we go?
I've just been enjoying, it's only 5 episodes in, I think, maybe 4. The new offering from, I think it's on Paramount Plus, the new Tom Hardy, Pierce Brosnan, Irish gangster show, Mobland, set in the UK. I'm just a big Tom Hardy fan, and he burns up the screen as usual. I've particularly enjoyed his recent turns as mobster type. This role, he's kind of a beleaguered fixer, so it's a little different than his wonderful role as the Jewish gangster in Peaky Blinders. A very malevolent force, which we've mentioned months and months and months ago on the podcast. So I'm enjoying that. And also with Helen Mirren as the Lady Macbeth, type of sorts that's not quite on point, but it's becoming increasingly clear, and Helen Mirren's always great, that she's the yin to Pierce Brosnan's yang, and you think at first she's just advisor, but it looks like she has plans of her own. So I don't know. We'll see how it lands. It's it's a Guy Ritchie show, I should say. So fans of Guy Ritchie will enjoy it.
He of The Gentleman, right, which was a great show.
Yeah, and it's fun to see Pierce as a kind of. I mean, he plays it wonderfully. There's this sort of always present malevolence to him that sort of acting for that sort of character you can't really teach, and it's good to see a seasoned actor doing it wonderfully. So it's good to go for that reason too.
So I just finished up season 3 of Bosch Legacy, which is kind of a spin-off show of Bosch. Seasons 1 and 2 of Bosch Legacy were definitely a letdown compared to the original show. Season 3 was actually pretty solid. The last episode, it's weird. They almost ended the show on episode 9 and then kind of did something else for episode 10. So that was a little bit strange. But Titus Welliver as Bosch, I mean, did an amazing job as usual. I would highly recommend it if you haven't watched it. Watch the series Bosch, just the original one. I think it's like 5 or 6 seasons and Amazon Prime. It's fantastic. Very, very well done.
It's also full of LA porn. That is Los Angeles visual porn for those who.
Excuse me? That usually means something very different, right?
No, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
When you say LA porn, you just think that's just porn. No,
that's just porn, right? It's just people from LA.
For fans of LA, that's another reason to like the show. It's he lives in this iconic building or house up in the Hollywood Hills, and it's based on the series of novels which preceded the series. And the original one I've watched, I haven't watched Legacy, but yeah, it's good. It's good TV, at least the original.
This is terrific. We don't preview these recommendations to each other before the show, so therefore you guys couldn't have known that ever since Severance and White Lotus ended, I've been completely bereft of good TV. I've been reduced to watching like the second season of Wheel of Time, which we were both just discussing, has some problems.
The third season of Wheel of Time, right? I think it's
Is it the third? Oh my gosh, see, it's so like bland and nondescript that I
can't even keep track.
Yeah. I'm sure you are. I'm sure you're right, Ryan. But whatever season it is, it's like gruel. It's like a kind of fantasy show gruel where you just have those sort of like nondescript. Anyway, that's not my recommendation, obviously. Neither is the Minecraft movie, which I did see and which is some kind of manic. It's like having some kind of manic episode. But I have a bit of a Rube Goldberg machine of an endorsement because happy news is that I have a new book contract. I'm writing a book about language that will be out in not anytime particularly soon, but that's a major project that I'm working on. And that means that most of my reading that is not my weekend novel reading is about language in some variety or another. And usually that means you don't have good book recommendations for people because it's like, oh, I read Noam Chomsky today on the language in the brain, and so it has sort of limited appeal. But I was very excited that I came across a really readable popular history that I actually think anybody, even people that are not language nerds like me, would be really interested in. This is a history of the decipherment of cuneiform, which, if you don't know, is the writing system that is used to write Akkadian and Sumerian, a variety of ancient Mesopotamian languages. And it was lost, then rediscovered in the 19th century as archaeology became sort of the thing for the European empires. But cuneiform, even more than hieroglyphs, it's one of the hardest alphabets in the world, akin to Japanese in that it has pictograms, or rather logograms. They're called the symbols that stand in for words, but also the same symbol sometimes can stand in for syllables. Anyway, and it depends on which language you happen to be reading, and they didn't even always know which language they were reading. So Josh Hammer's book, The Mesopotamian Riddle, is just a rip-roaring, high-octane, good time story about how this incredible feat of empire and of scholarship and of Western learning was accomplished. It's not our friend Josh Hammer who writes for the site sometimes.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah. It's different Josh Hammer,
I had
but
no
it is
idea
blurb.
of his range. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, what a remarkable man. It is blurbed by another friend of ours, Barry Strauss, who writes for CRB sometimes. And the last part of this intricate and quite roundabout endorsement is that if you want a little taster of why you should read this book, I wrote a Substack piece about one of my favorite details from this story and from this book, which is at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. And it's called The Time a Priest and His Bible Outsmarted the Cool Kids, which is my favorite part of this story. So that is all the time we have and then some. So thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. It's always a pleasure, and we're glad to have you with us. If you want to know more about everything we do, you can and should go to AmericanMind.org for the American Mind, ClaremontReviewBooks.com for our sister publication, the Claremont Review of Books. And you can check out our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. Lots of awesome stuff going on over there these days, as you may imagine. If you want to donate to support everything we do, you can go to claremont.org/donate. We greatly appreciate donations of all sizes, large and small. And if you want to support this show in particular, the best thing you can do is rate it 5 stars wherever you're listening and share it with your friends and subscribe. Thanks to our production and engineering crew, the brothers Gannon, Jake, and Ryan G. And thanks to you all for listening. Talk to you next week.